In 1963, the economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz released a voluminous text that was the result of years of research, smartly called A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960. The book set out to investigate the role the money supply played in the economy, and Friedman and Schwartz had cobbled together what data they could to see if Keynes's belief that money was not neutral held any weight. Milton Friedman was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics in large part for this work, though Anna Schwartz strangely was not, despite the fact that Friedman had joined Schwartz's research team for it, not the other way around. Their work is famous for propagating a few important, now widely held claims about the role of the money supply in the economy. First is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. By this, they meant that inflation was always the result of too much money circulating in the economy, and deflation was always the result of too little money. Proper management of the money supply by the Federal Reserve should then always be able to manage the price level. In addition to these claims about inflation, Friedman and Schwartz also investigated the role of the money supply in the business cycle. The classical economists had assumed the money supply would have no role in the business cycle, but Keynes had overturned the theory of money neutrality and claimed that the money supply was central to recessions because prices and wages were sticky. A lower money supply would mean lower aggregate demand and an economic downturn. As it turns out, Friedman and Schwartz could only find 6 periods in their history where the money supply contracted outright. They coincided with the 6 most severe economic downturns over that time period: the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, the Panic of 1907, the post-war dip after World War I, the Great Depression, and the second downturn that happened in the midst of the recovery from the Depression. But what was incredible is that these contractions in the money supply did not seem to be symptoms of the recession, but rather the causes of them. Let's start with the Panic of 1873. Was it the frenzy of bank runs contracting the supply of credit that led to the reduction in the money supply? No. The contraction in the money supply predates the panic, when it contracted by 4.6% as the U.S. demonetized silver and returned to a strict gold standard, and, you'll remember, kicked off the Long Depression, which saw the rise of the free silver movement devoted to undoing this change. But that same movement would worsen the Long Depression with the Panic of 1893. As William Jennings Bryan was gaining steam, people who held a lot of gold were worried that the U.S. would indeed monetize silver again by issuing paper money backed by silver. With an increase in the money supply looming on the horizon, investors expected interest rates to fall, which made foreign investments with relatively higher interest rates more attractive. These investors moved tons of their gold overseas to protect it from the uncertainty, and in doing so, they caused a 5.8% drop in the money supply, which remained exclusively on the gold standard. Well, surely the Panic of 1907 was its own cause of the contraction in the money supply. We talked about how Otto Heinz attempted that shady maneuver to manipulate the price of United Copper and failed so spectacularly that he took down the Knickerbocker Trust Company and set off a wave of bank runs. Yes and no. Friedman and Schwartz found that the reduction in the money supply was due to an increase in reserve ratios banks set for themselves in response to the panic. But had they maintained their reserve ratios and continued lending, the money supply would not have shrunk. After World War I, the U.S. saw a relatively brief recession as the economy transitioned to peacetime. But in the years that followed, the U.S. experienced higher than normal inflation, and the Fed responded by sharply increasing their discount rate from 4.75% to 7%, which was the highest it had ever charged to that time. The policy was successful in stopping the inflation, But unfortunately, that was because it was so successful in plunging the economy into a recession. Then there was the Great Depression, which came in two waves. The initial wave of recession from 1929 to 1933, and then the second wave, or double dip, which happened in 1937 and 1938. We know the story here, right? The stock market crashed, causing a panic, and in the uncertainty, there was a wave of bank failures, which didn't end until FDR's banking holiday and New Deal programs. But when FDR raised taxes for Social Security, the economy sank again. Friedman and Schwartz disagree. They found a singular culprit. It was all the way back in 1928 when the Federal Reserve, off-put by the excess and cultural change of the 1920s, decided to tighten monetary policy and raise interest rates, causing the economy to slow. That brought about the downturn in the summer of 1929 that made investors pause and the stock market to plunge. That all might have been okay, a correction of a market bubble. But then, in 1931, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in order to attract more gold into their reserves, to maintain the gold standard after Britain moved off it, and many assumed the US would too. But we didn't. Instead, we forced the Fed into an impossible situation where they had to choose between their legal obligation to the gold standard and the collapse of the entire economy. But leave it to them to botch the job even worse than they had to. After pressure from Hoover and Congress, the Fed did try to alleviate the problems by pushing interest rates down with open market operations. But they pulled the plug on them far too soon and allowed them to rise again just months later, sealing the fate of the economy. All told, the money supply shrank by 25% between 1929 and 1933 due to these policies. So what about the double dip? Does the Keynesian explanation of higher taxes explain what happened there? Friedman and Schwartz say no. They pin the blame on, once again, the Federal Reserve, which in 1937, for reasons passing all understanding, they doubled the required reserve ratio, shrinking the money supply again. In their landmark book, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz had poured through a mountain of historical records and in them found the bedrock of a new understanding of the economy. Where Keynes had seen animal spirits, they had found bad monetary policy. The Long Depression owed itself to the gold standard and the uncertainty surrounding it. The Panic of 1907 was driven by the lack of a good central bank, but the post-war dip was driven by the mistakes made by the newly formed central bank. And the perfect storm that brought on the Great Depression was both the gold standard, which entangled the world together, and sheer incompetence on the part of the Federal Reserve. So conclusive were their findings that most of the economics profession today agrees that the Great Depression was only great because of the mismanagement of the Federal Reserve. At a conference in 2002, one of the members of the Fed's Board of Governors, Ben Bernanke, gave a talk in which both Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz were in attendance. Bernanke closed with the following: "Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I would like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." As fate would have it, Ben Bernanke would later be appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, where he would face the greatest economic crisis the U.S. had seen since the Great Depression.